Hi, I'm Sarah de Lagarde, and I am Brighter Future Strategist here at Janus Henderson. And on this episode of the Ampersand Factor, I am joined by Richard Clode, my colleague who looks after our technology funds at Janus Henderson.
Thank you for having me on.
I'm always wondering about your levels of resilience. Now, I speak about resilience quite a lot, and it seems to be one of those themes that people get really, really into.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge responsibility when our clients, entrust us with their money and their financial goals that they're trying to achieve. I think we take that, we call it fiduciary responsibility, but we take that responsibility very seriously. I think, we've had to go through a lot in recent years. We had a pandemic. We've got a, guy in the White House that, announced his policy on X. We've had an awful lot going on. I think there are just several factors in the world that just mean we're going to have more of this, and so I think resiliency is even more important. I think we could talk about that as part of being active managers and how important that is. But there's no point being an active manager if you don't have resiliency and you're going to panic at every new headline or something that's happening in the world. So I think it's a very important part of what we do for our clients.
So how do you do it? How do you manage to keep your calm when things are going all directions? I mean, we've seen market volatility constantly over the past year and more. So how do you keep calm? How do you have that self-confidence? Because I'm pretty sure that I've never seen you nervous. I have always seen you, very positively minded. How do you do that?
From an investment point of view, the foundation is, we talk about investment philosophies and a process. Now, that looks nice on a PowerPoint slide, but actually in these sort of environments, it's incredibly important, because if you come back to your philosophy that you think, the profits of a company are important to where, that stock price goes, well, then you can use that to frame any piece of, volatility or news that happened. That's your kind of North Star, your sort of centerpiece, and you feel comfortable there. And it helps you make sense of all of the things that have been going on in the world around you.
Yeah, and that makes total sense to me. It's the experience as well. I mean, you've been a portfolio manager for quite some years as well. So you've seen the different scenarios play out, and that gives you confidence that you have been able to manage that in the past. But is there, and this is an uncomfortable question probably, but is there a moment in your career that you felt like you made the wrong decision? There was a potential for failure or actual failure. Have you experienced that, and what kind of lessons have you learned from that?
The key is, sometimes, history does rhyme, but it doesn't, always exactly repeat. So, we, went back in March 2020, we were trying to take some of our experiences from the global financial crisis into that period. Now, it's not the same, one's a global pandemic, one's a global systematic financial crisis, but, is there anything we could kind of learn from that? So, you think about, how you deal with that on one side, but then the flip side, and this is almost as important, and maybe there's something that I got wrong personally back in, early 2009, is it's so easy to, just be in that doom loop and like, oh my God, things are so bad. But, ultimately, if we're discounting that very bad outlook and then something changes and it could be better than that, doesn't have to be great, but it's better than that, actually stocks could go up a lot. And I think that's what I missed back in March 2009 was that, all the central banks got together and just drew a line in the sand. Whatever it takes, we're not letting it go anymore that way. And we're going to, provide some stability here. And that was a great entry point into the market. And a lot of stocks went up a lot. And I was sort of too defensively sort of positioned in that. And we tried to sort of, take that into both March 2020 to sort of say, right, well, at some point, hopefully we're going to find a solution for this. And at that point, you're going to want to own some very different stocks. That's a good opportunity to step in. So I think kind of taking an experience where hopefully we learned from it, that back in, 2009, we could have done it better. We protected the portfolio very well, but then maybe didn't lean into the opportunity as well as we could on the other side. We took that both into the pandemic and then into Liberation Day to do a bit better on the other side.
That makes sense. I noticed that you say we. That is, you talk about yourself and the team that you work with. And I know that in previous conversations, you've mentioned collaboration with your team was quite important as well, not just one person making one decision and bearing the burden of that responsibility for that decision. How do you lean on your team? How does that collaboration help you on a day-to-day?
Exactly. And I think I was quite conscious of that, having been more sort of junior back in 2009, but being sat around a desk with my teammates and learning from more experienced people who had seen things before that, the dot-com crash or the Asian debt crisis, and some of their experiences they then shared with me. But I think, when it comes to that resiliency, we're always stronger sharing with others, and particularly people who do the same thing as you. And so being able to talk to someone who has, understands it because they're literally doing the same thing, I think is very helpful. I think the beauty of particularly sort of, Graham and Alison I've worked with for the last 11 years is that, I think we're just very honest with each other, and we know when, we invested in a stock and it's just reported and it's terrible and we've got it wrong and the stock's down 30%. We're not perfect. It's okay. Let's talk about it. Let's just think about the best thing to do, thinking about it more from a portfolio base. I've found that very helpful to manage the ups and downs of managing quite a volatile sort of sector, and ultimately making better decisions, which is the key. I think it helps you to have a longer career, to be able to have that sort of resiliency of that teamwork. I think ultimately you end up with better performance because you're making better decisions and being less emotional about it on the time.
Yeah, that's an amazing response. Very candid as well. I was wondering about the next generation. You talked about, the advantages of being in the office versus working from home because you can share experiences and knowledge that way. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who would like to become a portfolio manager ultimately?
And I think the biggest challenge we've seen for people coming from, academic sort of background as they leave university and graduate and then come into this world is, people generally who come into this industry have done well at school and at university and ace everything and get A grades and get 90% marks. And then you're coming into, investment world where, if you're, getting the majority of your stocks right, you've done a pretty good job. Just having that intellectual humility to admit you're wrong. I can say from personal experience, that took me a little bit longer to let go of that because, you want to be given more responsibility. You want to be right. And actually the biggest opportunity cost can be staying in things where you're wrong and you just want to be proven right. But, hope's not a investment process or a strategy. So just kind of letting go, unless you're candid about that, unless you have that trust from the team to be able to say that, you're going to end up with suboptimal decisions, suboptimal positioning in your portfolio, holding onto stocks that you shouldn't do, missing opportunities. And that all gets sort of brought up in this kind of, just having that humility on the team. And I think, sometimes particularly younger, people on the team that are so keen to impress, that's harder for them to let go of that because, they have imposter syndrome or they desperately want to get ahead. That's hard. I think it's easier to do when you're a little bit older and you've just had a few mistakes and you've kind of known how to own them over time.
Very good response, I think. I was wondering if you could summarize what resilience means to you in 3 words. Do you think you can do that?
I think sort of patience. I think, calm. And maybe I'll sort of cheat a little bit and have a sort of two words here is the right outcome. So, I think a lot about investing is to not panic. I think it helps if you have a certain type of character to begin with, but I think I've always heard you talk about resilience as being a sort of a muscle that needs to kind of be worked. And I think, again, you can work at that over time. So, another bit of advice I always give to people joining into this industry is don't get too emotional about it. It's great when you're proved right and that stock does really well, but, don't let the emotions get too high then, because if you're going to be emotional about it that way, you're going to feel really down on the other side. So, I think all of this is, we talked about that foundation of having a process and philosophy, just come back to it and just sort of say, right. So, has something changed or maybe it hasn't? Just having that calmness to ultimately end up with the right outcomes. And the right outcomes longer term. I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but I can be pretty confident on the outlook on several years out. And again, ending up and having that sort of laser focus on the right outcome for our clients is not thinking about tomorrow, but thinking about what we can achieve for them over sort of a multi-year sort of period. I think it's very important to that resiliency.
If you want to be really good at something, you have to enjoy it as well, because all of your passion comes from the fact that you actually enjoy coming into work.
Exactly. And I think, we have a privilege of, I know how much you love, your role has evolved into a brighter future strategist and you love this role. And it's I think it really excites you to come into work and do things like this. And the same for me. I know how lucky I am that I have a job that I genuinely enjoy doing. And, that I think there's sort of different parts to that, but I've not met too many successful, investors or fund managers that didn't love what they do day to day, researching stocks, picking stocks, producing those end outcomes for clients. And obviously for us, we're invested in the fund too. So, that for us is, something that really motivates you to do this. And as, when we talk about resiliency, having that resiliency of actually, I love doing this. And I think it's hard to do that unless you have a passion, for it, and you actually genuinely enjoy doing this and you genuinely want to deliver those outcomes for clients.
Well, that's a fantastic way to conclude our interview. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, sir.